What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we are going to be taking a look at a fairly old Jon McCray or Whaddoyoumeme video about why God allows children, or specifically gives children, cancer. So we're going to be taking a look at that today. Now, going into this, I've only somewhat looked at his video, so you're going to get a very fresh look at my reaction to his opinion about this. But what Jon McCray, as well as some other people, including, I know that Cameron Bertuzzi joined in on it. I think Mike Winger also joined in on various response videos to a friendly atheist video talking about several reasons why you might want to not believe in God or may want to doubt God's existence. In any case, he's going to be telling us or explaining to us why we shouldn't be so critical of the God of the Bible as far as kids with cancer goes. So if you want to fuck around and find out how bad Jon McCray's apologetics are, then please stay tuned. So tonight we are discussing Jon McCray's position on why exactly God allows kids to get cancer or gives kids cancer. So it's my understanding in the Christian theology that God creates all of us, like God knitted us in our mother's womb before we're born. God plans out our entire life, and God gives us free will, but at the same time, he knows all of the decisions that we're going to make in our life, which kind of makes it a little bit of weird kind of thing on the whole free will deal. But the point is that apparently God knits us in the womb and God creates us and stuff. And so with that in mind, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me why God would give kids cancer or create kids that would get cancer, or why does cancer even exist in the first place? I really don't understand why God would think that cancer would be like giving somebody cancer, forcing them to live with all of the horrible shit that comes with cancer, and then depending on the type of cancer you get, you could die or you could beat it. I don't understand that. So it seems to me like there's no good reason to give somebody cancer. Whatever you hope to accomplish by giving somebody cancer, I'm fairly certain that you could accomplish something similar in a different way that does not involve cancer or that doesn't involve any suffering at all. Like there's definitely avenues that are unexplored by God that would accomplish whatever he's trying to accomplish without the need for this kind of shit. So that's my understanding of it, that's my understanding of the Christian theology behind it, and then that's my problems with the theology of Christianity. So let's see if Jon McCray here can convince me otherwise, convince me away from that position. I doubt it, but let's see.
This video is part of a playlist. If you want to watch the whole playlist, you know what I'm saying, I say you go ahead and watch the playlist, and if so, go ahead and click the link down below in the description. Let's go ahead and get started. What argument do we have today that proves that God does not exist? What argument are we going to consider today that proves that God does not exist? Let's go ahead and hear it. Hit me. No, I meant hit me with the next objection.
Pediatric cancer.
Okay, that was a very short argument. Let's hear it again.
Pediatric cancer.
I think I got this one. So the argument is, because I can't think of any good reason why God would allow children to have cancer, therefore there couldn't possibly be a good reason.
Is there a good reason to give kids cancer? I can't think of a good reason to give a child cancer. I get that McCray here is trying to suggest that there could be a good reason for a kid to get cancer, but anybody that's either known somebody that has had cancer or that has had cancer themselves or just has watched a movie about people with cancer would know that there is no good reason to give somebody cancer unless you're Wade Wilson, or to not prevent it if you can. There's no good reason not to prevent cancer. But as I was going, Wade Wilson, he had cancer riddling his body, and that forced him into his mutation, and that drove him insane and gave us Deadpool. I still think that you could have probably given Deadpool his mutant abilities without the need for cancer. So no, not even on the Deadpool argument could you really fully defend giving somebody cancer. It's one, a horrible way to live with cancer. Two, it's a horrible way to die because of cancer. Like, all of it's just fucking horrible. Oh, they must have done something to deserve it. Yep. I mean, that's got to be the answer, right, hun?
Right? Okay. Got it. Now, believe it or not, and I'm genuine when I say this video is actually a breath of fresh air. And the reason I say so is because the last two videos that I did in this series were not clear at all. It was pretty hard to see how it led to, therefore, God does not exist. But in this video, it's a lot easier to understand. The argument is basically because God allows children to have cancer, therefore, God does not exist. As usual, and because I'm somewhat of a nice guy, somewhat of a nice guy, then I'm going to go ahead and make this argument better than it actually is in its current form. The argument in its strongest form that I'm aware of would be something like, if God exists and he's all loving, then he wouldn't allow bad things to happen to innocent children. Bad things happen to innocent children, like children getting cancer. Therefore, God cannot exist.
This argument right here is an argument specifically against any omnibenevolent God. And most often, people of the Abrahamic faith, they claim that their God is omnibenevolent. And so that's what this argument is against. Most people are confronted with either Christianity or Islam or some Abrahamic type of religion. So therefore, I mean, that's generally what people associate it with. So most people are going to sit there and assume an Abrahamic God. So that's why they would probably say, well, God doesn't exist. Technically, what they're saying is that the Abrahamic God doesn't exist. And I would agree that the problem of suffering is a pretty big problem for Christian theology and versions of the Abrahamic God in general. So McCray is expanding upon the pediatric cancer point that Hemant Mehta was making. I really should have looked up the original video from Hemant Mehta. It was a long time ago. These three guys, I think, Jon McCray, Cameron Bertuzzi, and Mike Winger, they kind of went through all of Hemant's points against this omnibenevolent version of God existing. I don't think that this argument, the problem of suffering, works for every single idea about God, because obviously, if you're not claiming that your God is omnibenevolent, this argument's not going to mean anything. You can have a God and he be an asshole and cause suffering all over the world, right? This is obviously very specific to the omnibenevolent theistic type of God.
All right, story time. So for those that don't know, I have the most incredibly adorable 2 baby boys on the entire planet, right? Right now, they're 5 months old and 4 years old. And I just love my boys. When it came time for me to take my oldest boy to the dentist for the first time, I did what any dad would do. Rather than putting him through torture and having him hate me, I told my wife that she had to take him. So when that didn't work, I ended up at the dentist's office, sitting there with my boy. And as usual, the dentist comes in and the dentist tries to make him happy, tries to make him laugh, and he just was not having it. He was just terrified of the dentist and would not chill out for a second to let the dentist start looking inside of his mouth. So at this point, he starts screaming, he starts crying, and he starts reaching for me. And instead of me reaching for him, grabbing him, and taking him from the dentist, instead, what I had to do was actually hold him down so that way the dentist can continue to look inside of his mouth. Not only could he not understand why I didn't save him when he's reaching out for me, but he also couldn't understand why I actually held him down and allowed him to suffer. And for me, it was really kind of difficult at this point, to be straight up with you. And the reason why is because I wanted him to understand, but I knew that there wasn't anything that I could say that he could understand. I mean, he was barely kind of getting through basic language at this point. He just couldn't understand the language or even these big concepts of the greater good. Now, in a similar way, I don't see any reason why it couldn't be the same with God. If God created the entire universe and he knows everything there is to know, then he would also know how everything must go together for the greater good, even if we couldn't see it or comprehend it.
I think he might be getting into a caveat here in a second, because I remember a caveat there. But he's trying to compare taking his son to the dentist, which is a good thing, the son being scared, obviously, and then having to, not comfort his son during it, but forcing his son to go through with it and everything like that. I don't see how that's comparable to a child with cancer or like real suffering. Like he characterizes this as suffering, but at the same time, this is not the kind of suffering that we're talking about here. This is not like the kind of suffering where a child is dying of starvation. People just aren't doing anything about it or whatnot. This is is not comparable whatsoever. So I understand the point that Jon McCray is trying to make here. I understand that he's like, oh, well, his kid has to suffer because it's ultimately good for him. And you can make that kind of argument for a dentist chair. Like going to see the dentist, you can make an argument for that. There are real benefits to that. What are the benefits to cancer or a child starving to death in the streets or any of the horrible things that happen to children? Like, how can you really make a case for a child having cancer as being like a good thing that we just don't even comprehend yet? They're gonna die. And I mean, maybe the good thing is that, oh, well, then they'll get to heaven faster. Well, then fucking God can just blink his life out of existence. God doesn't have to put that child through the most horrible pain that they can imagine. God doesn't have to sit there and watch a child starve to death in the streets. God also doesn't have to sit back and watch a priest molest a kid so many times that they end up killing themselves later in life. Like, God doesn't have to allow these things to happen. God can snap and change shit in an instant. He's like fucking Thanos up there with the goddamn reality stone. He can make reality whatever he wants, but he doesn't choose to. I'm not saying that God has to make this reality without suffering, but I feel like the most egregious versions of suffering out there, he could definitely just fucking blink away. Vanta Blue says, I love that he offhand just proved that prayers are unneeded. If God already has a plan, prayers do nothing, the plan won't change. Right. Like people praying for cancer patients. What's the point in that? God is obviously meant for that person to have cancer for a reason. It's either for God's own shits and giggles that he wants to put that person through the worst pain in their life, or whatever fucking reason else. But if the point is that that child or that person is fast tracked to God in the afterlife, then God could figure out a better way so that it minimizes the suffering. Like, I'm not saying get rid of suffering, but minimizes it. And to sit there and claim that, oh, well, maybe God just knows how this is good for us and we're just too myopic or we're just too ignorant to understand why uncontrolled cancer in children is a good thing. I'm not going to sit here and try to suggest that there's a good reason why people should be suffering. Like, that's beyond me. That's beyond my compassion. Like, if God can think of a good reason why somebody should suffer through cancer, then I feel like I'm a much better and much more morally just person than God has ever been.
And just like my son, who was too little to understand the greater good, how much more would it be for an infinite God that knows literally everything? Therefore, we couldn't possibly know all of the reasons for why God allows suffering to happen. Now, I should probably make this clear because I know how the internet gets. The comparison is not between the dentist and having cancer. That's not the comparison. The comparison is just to highlight how limited our minds are and our limited cognition. That's all.
Well, but you see, you have to understand, though, that the analogy between cancer patients and son at the dentist, you can make a good justification for your son suffering through the dentist, right? That version of suffering, like that kind of suffering, you can make a good case for needing to go through that kind of suffering. And the problem that I see is that there is no good reason to put somebody through cancer, let alone a child. Okay, so it's not a matter of being myopic. It's not a matter of being ignorant or having limited knowledge. It's literally not a matter of any of that. The problem is that there literally is no good reason to put somebody through that amount of pain and suffering in order for them to just die in the end. There are other ways for people to die. They can die in their sleep, just one day, dead. That's happened to a number of people in my own family. They've died in their sleep. Ethan Stiles in the comments said, as a childhood cancer survivor, I wholeheartedly agree, GE. Fuck cancer. Yeah, definitely. Fuck cancer. Because the pure fact that there exists so many other different ways to accomplish whatever you're looking to accomplish with cancer, do anything else. That is needless suffering. By just just maybe it's just a matter of compassion. Like, I have more compassion than God does. If God feels that it's necessary to put somebody through cancer as a child or even as an adult at any point in somebody's life to put them through cancer, I feel like I have more compassion than whoever that could be that thinks that's necessary.
But if you really think about it, sometimes in life we are able to see the greater good that comes from suffering, and we see how it made us better people. A lot of people would say that even though they went through something absolutely horrible, they wouldn't take it back for anything. And they say the reason they wouldn't take it back is because it made them better people and it made them who they were today.
Well, true. Just like I can't rule out that some good could come out of some kind of suffering, except cancer, because fuck cancer. It's equally as likely that the exact same result could have come about through a different path, like a different set of things that happened. You can't sit there and rule all of that out just because this was the conclusion of this one path of suffering. You simply can't say, well, that was the only way in order to get to that particular conclusion. There's no way that you can say that. You could definitely propose that there are multiple different ways in order to accomplish whatever you're looking to accomplish. So it literally makes no sense to focus on, well, good shit happened because of this suffering, so therefore that suffering had to happen. No, it didn't. It didn't have to happen. There could have been various other ways in which to get to that particular conclusion.
I'm not saying that happens in every case, but that's one example of how we can see good come from suffering that otherwise couldn't be achieved if that suffering was not there.
Another bit of nuance to make here is, what do we mean by suffering? Because in this particular argument, we're not focused on, like, I guess what you could call minor suffering, right? Like having to suffer through a dentist appointment. That would be a minor thing, I would think. Depends on what you get done. Even if you suffered, like, let's say you had a root canal and you had a swollen jaw for like a month or whatnot. Let's just say that you had like a swollen jaw for a month or something like that for whatever fucking reason. Like, I think that that's more of a minor bit of suffering than like a child starving elsewhere in the world, or some of the other types of suffering that are really hard on your health that causes needless suffering and things of that sort. Like those are the kind of things that I'm talking about here. When we're talking about suffering in this particular context, we're talking about children with cancer, children that haven't had the time yet to do something horrible in their life or anything like that. Not that anything that you could do would require getting cancer or would justify getting cancer. I'm just saying that, like, these are kids that are suffering some of the worst pain that you could imagine, having to go through all of it, that are having to suffer day in and day out, and they fight for their lives. And to sit there and suggest, oh, you got cancer for a good reason, like, that's just shitty, in my opinion. Like, it's shitty to try to say that you got it for a good reason or some shit like that.
With that perspective in mind, how does it follow that if bad things happen, God does not exist? The only thing that follows from if bad things happen would be that we don't know the reasons for why God would allow bad things to happen. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist.
Well, on a bit of a nuance here, I agree that just because suffering does exist, that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. More specifically, I would say that suffering existing definitely proves that this God that could or could not exist is not omnibenevolent. If the God that exists is the God of the Bible, and the God of the Bible being omnibenevolent, then it seems to me like suffering existing in general would not be a thing if God was truly omnibenevolent. And the fact that we as humans, with our limited perception of the universe, with our limited knowledge, know that there's no good reason for needless suffering in this reality, but yet needless suffering exists. I think that is good enough to show that this omnibenevolent God of the Bible doesn't exist. He's putting it in a bit more of a grander scope than I think that it actually is. I definitely think that this is a good argument against the Abrahamic God, but I wouldn't go as far as to say, oh, this proves God doesn't exist. But then again, that's my agnostic atheist side that's showing here.
And lastly, I just want to say the fact that greater goods come from suffering is especially evident on Christianity. So why does God allow suffering? I don't know. But what I do know is that on Christianity, the answer can't be because he doesn't care and he doesn't love us.
Try to rationalize this sentence real quick. God loves me so much, and he has so much passion or compassion for me that he gave me cancer. Like, can you imagine rationalizing that for any other person or figure or character at all? Like, oh my God, he loves me so much and he cares about me so much that he gave me an STD. What? Oh yeah, he filled me with cancer. That's how he loves me. Are you fucking serious right now? Giving somebody cancer does not scream love to me or compassion. I don't see how you can say, oh, this being loves me so much, he gave me cancer, or he allowed me to get cancer. Or what about this being loves and cares about me so much, he let Father McFeely really ram it to me in the rectory. Like, he gave it to me hard, but it was for a good reason, and God knows that reason. I just can't fathom like being okay with that being said of anybody else.
On the contrary, God actually lowered himself to become a victim of injustice and violence on earth. And what did he do when he came to earth? He suffered. In Christianity, the greatest conceivable good is when God actually took on human flesh and came into our world to provide a way for us to be rightly related to him. And he did that through suffering.
So this whole message of Christianity really kind of boggles me, because it's like, oh, well, God suffered for a little bit and then died and resurrected. Oh, okay. Good for him. Listen, if you really compare it, did God suffer as Jesus all that much? Like, is that really suffering for him? Because if you consider it, God's an eternal being. And then for a 30-year period, maybe, he became human, apparently. And then for, half a day, maybe? Half a day he suffered and died. Half a day. He suffered for half a day? Casey said, fucking cry me a river, you little bitch. I'm not all that convinced by an eternal being suffering for half a day and then continuing on his eternal way. Like, that doesn't, like, if you compare the amount of time he spent not suffering to the time he spent suffering, it's not, it's barely registering. Like, if you put that shit on the pie graph, like, the outline of the sliver that would be the amount of time God suffered would be bigger than the amount of time that God suffered. So, I mean, it's crazy to me to sit there and use that as like, oh, well, God suffered and he absolved all the sins of the world. Oh, are you kidding? What are sins? Well, sins are when you transgress God's commandments and what God wants. Oh, so you mean that God took on human form and had people beat him and persecute him in a BDSM-like manner and then crucify him and he died, all to change his own opinion? That's what it did. Sins are transgressing God's opinion. God felt it necessary to kill himself in order to change his own opinion about things. Like, how does that make sense? Like, I get it. All the Christians that are watching this right now that are probably not even still here, they're sitting there like, that's not what it is. That's a really bad, like, exegesis or whatever in the fuck of my religion. That's horrible. I don't understand how, like, that was the only option for God. Like, why couldn't God just change his opinion on things? Like, why was the blood of Jesus necessary? I mean, Paul explains why it's necessary, because when Jesus died and he had a whole new body that was created that was without sin, that's what our future resurrection bodies are. So as long as we believe in Christ, we get these nice new pristine Cadillac or Lexus versions of our bodies. Just imagine my body, but without the fat and a working pancreas. That's the future resurrection body that would be waiting for me. And that's how you get into heaven or whatnot, because it's a sinless body that was made from the promise instead of David's nutsack. Like, Paul explains like that in that kind of way, it makes sense. But in the way that current Christians kind of understand this absolution of sins, like, why couldn't God just sort of change his mind? Like, with a flick of his wrist and a twinkle of his dick. He could have changed his mind about what pissed him off about humanity. But no, he didn't. He decided to go down to earth, get whipped a little bit, and then die on a cross like a pansy-ass bitch.
So the reason why there's suffering in this world can't be because God doesn't care. At least not in Christianity.
Oh, yes. God definitely cares about watching people suffer. God definitely loves sitting back in his lazy boy, flipping the channels between kids starving to death in Africa, the Holocaust, as well as the cancer ward at whatever hospital, the pediatric cancer ward. God loves flipping between those channels and seeing all of that suffering. I mean, maybe God's a dick. If you describe a person as showing love and compassion by watching children die of cancer, is that really love and compassion? If you apply that to any other figure at all, whether he's real or magical, let's say the Loch Ness Monster loves to watch children die of cancer or some shit. Yeah, rude. The Loch Ness Monster would be a dick. Anybody else would be a dick. That fucking leprechaun from those goddamn leprechaun movies, he's a fucking dick. At least he doesn't watch cancer patients die. I mean, I guess maybe he could. I mean, I don't know. I feel like he would be more apt to just go right ahead and kill people rather than watch them suffer. I don't get it. This does not scream compassion to me, and I will never understand why it's showing compassion. If there are any apologists that are still watching this and made it through the whole calling Jesus a pansy-ass bitch on the cross, explain to me, how is it showing compassion to give a child cancer, or to allow a child to get cancer, or to allow a child to be raped by a priest or a pastor or uncle or anybody? How is that showing compassion? That's going to be it for Jon McCray's video tonight. All in all, for this video, I didn't find it all that convincing. I get that Jon McCray there, of Whaddoyoumeme, wasn't trying to use his analogy of his son going to the dentist. There's nothing about being given cancer or having cancer that could show compassion. Whatever you're hoping to accomplish by allowing somebody or giving somebody cancer, I think that you could accomplish it another way, like a different way, unless you're like a mad scientist that's studying the effects of cancer or cancer treatments. Other than that, which I don't think that God would be doing, but other than that, which that would still make that scientist an asshole, by the way, that's totally unethical. I think in any other respects, people would paint this God character's actions as far as causing people to suffer or creating the situations for people to suffer and studying that or watching that happen and unfold. Everybody would call that unethical if it was done by anybody else. But because it's done by God, and apparently God has the ultimate authority over everything, God can do it and not be a dick. But in any case, I'm not convinced by Jon McCray's video. I don't see how allowing kids to get cancer or allowing any kind of needless suffering to be actually showing compassion. It seems like a bass-backwards thing to say. I'm very not convinced that the God of the Bible exists, because there might be a good reason for somebody to have cancer out there. I think that, like I've been saying this entire time, I think that anything that you could hope to accomplish by giving somebody cancer, you could definitely accomplish without that kind of needless suffering. If God is all knowing, then he knows a way to accomplish whatever he's going to do without giving somebody cancer or allowing somebody to have cancer. Until you can convince me out of that, then I will forever think that God is just a giant dick up there in heaven, stroking his ego while watching people needlessly suffer. That kind of seems like what the Christians are painting God as, in my opinion. So that's going to be it for the show tonight. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I know that I did. If you will, please go down below and let me know in the comments what you thought about tonight's video. If you will, while you're down there in the comments leaving me your thoughts, why don't you smash that like button right now? And hey, if you're not subscribed, then please go on ahead and subscribe. You made it this far. You made it through all of the nasty potty mouth shit. You might as well subscribe, because we got more shit coming. If you're leaving out, I hope you guys have an awesome weekend, and don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.